Thank you so much for everyone who has already hopped on. While we're waiting for others to join us, I just want to give a couple of reminders. Please, participants, keep yourself muted. That way we won't have to worry about any background noise while our panelists are speaking. I would also love to ask any of our participants to write in the chat where they're joining us from, especially if you're in Pennsylvania. We'd love to hear exactly where in Pennsylvania you are from and you are able to join us from. I am Maddie Allen. I am the Advocacy Manager at the Center for Public Justice. If you're unfamiliar with the Center for Public Justice, CPJ is a nonpartisan Christian public policy and civic engagement organization. Today, we're here to both educate and help mobilize Christians to support children and families affected by a broken juvenile justice system by providing concrete actions to support evidence-based reforms. So our outline today is we're going to get to hear a little bit about the current condition of the juvenile justice system in Pennsylvania and what the proposed legislation is doing to correct these issues and how leaders of the faith-based organizations and citizen advocates can support this work. Today, while our panelists are speaking, they might bring up some questions that you will have. So please feel free to use the Q&A section of Zoom throughout the event. And then after our panel is finished, you can add anything you have, any questions you have to that Q&A section of Zoom. You will also, after the event, be receiving a follow-up email with access to any of the resources mentioned today. They'll be included so you don't have to worry about writing everything down or missing anything. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel. So first, we will have Anna Hollis, who is the Executive Director of Amachi Pittsburgh, a unique partnership of secular and faith-based organizations working together to support families and children impacted by the criminal justice system. Who knows what God has brought us through this child is the English translation of Amachi and forms the centerpiece of the organization's mission to empower young minds to overcome the challenges of parental incarceration and thrive. As a strong advocate for equity and social justice, Anna has instituted programming that empowers youth and families to champion systems change, and her leadership in this arena has contributed to pivotal policy and legislative reform. Amachi has been working in Pittsburgh since 2003, so they'll be coming up on their 20-year anniversary soon, which is very exciting. We are so delighted to have her with us today. Next on our panel is State Senator Whitney Westerfield. He is an American politician and a Republican member of the Kentucky Senate representing District 3. Senator Westerfield currently serves as the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee and a member of the Capital Planning Advisory Board, Tobacco Fund Settlement Oversight, Agricultural, Natural Resources and Energy, Veterans, Military Affairs, Public Protection, and the Program Review and Investigations Committee in the State Senate. In 2013, Senator Westerfield served as a co-chairman of the Juvenile Code Reform Task Force, and during the 2014 regular session, sponsored Senate Bill 200, reflecting the work of the task force and bringing about the largest reform to Kentucky juvenile systems in 30 years. Senator Westerfield continues his juvenile justice policy work as the co-chairman of the SB 200 Oversight Council, overseeing the implementation of the bill, as well as exploring numerous other juvenile justice policies. In 2020, Senator Westerfield was named Senate Chair of the Jail and Corrections Reform Task Force. In January 2021, Senator Westerfield was named National Co-Chair of the National Conference of State Legislature Law, Criminal Justice, and Public Safety Committee. Thank you so much for joining us, Senator Westerfield. Next, we have Stephanie Summers, who is the CEO of the Center for Public Justice. Ms. Summers is the co-author with Washington Post columnist Michael J. Gershon and Katie Thompson of Unleashing Opportunity: Why Escaping Poverty Requires a Shared Vision of Justice. A frequent speaker and moderator, recent topics include Christian activism and reform public theology, and leadership in the Ruder Lake Handbook of Religious Literacy, Pluralism, and Global Engagement. Ms. Summers is a recipient of the inaugural Duke Divinity Reflective Leadership Award. She also serves as a trustee of Eastern University, where she received her MS in Nonprofit Management. Prior to her appointment at the Center for Public Justice, she spent 12 years with the CCO, where her roles included Vice President for the Eastern Region and Vice President for Organizational Development. Ms. Summers begins her career in nonprofit administration as the executive director of the Open Door, a church-based youth center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We are so thankful to have all three of these voices on our panels today. They all have either a vested interest in Pennsylvania and juvenile justice or the justice system as a whole. To begin our panel, I would first like to go to Ms. Hollis to talk about what it looks like right now in Pennsylvania. So research has shown that the majority of youth caught up in the Pennsylvania juvenile justice system entered it for low-level behavior. Could you give us some examples of the misdemeanors that commonly lead to children's over-involvement with the justice system?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think on the one hand, we're really talking about kids being kids, teenagers being teenagers, misbehaving and acting out in ways that all teenagers do, regardless of race, gender, economic status, across the board. Kids just misbehave. And the kinds of incidents that typically lead children in Pennsylvania to become involved in the system are sort of falling under this catch-all phrase of disorderly conduct. And that could be fighting. It could be, being disruptive in a classroom. It could be, stealing, truancy, underage drinking, smoking weed, a lot of the things that we know that teens are engaged in. And I think there's also this other element of how young people who are living in marginalized communities and who are significantly under-resourced, their schools, their communities, who have very few of the kinds of supports and pathways that young people need to be successful and to really process the trauma that they experience. I think when, that victimization and experience of trauma that a lot of young people feel, they act it out, they reenact what they've experienced. And so that's where you're probably going to see, maybe some violence involved. So maybe more fighting and things of that nature. So I just think it's important to really pay attention to who these students are as much as we do what they're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. A bipartisan Pennsylvania Juvenile Justice Task Force made 35 recommendations for improving outcomes for children in Pennsylvania. The three recommendations that the task force believes would make the most impact are diversion, stopping direct file prosecutions in adult court, holding kids in adult jails, and eliminating fines and fees as an accountability tool for children. Could you explain first exactly what diversion, direct file, and these fines and fees are? And then could you tell us how you've seen these issues affect the lives of youth in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, sure. So diversion is an alternative to juvenile detention or incarceration for nonviolent offenses. It really provides a restorative justice pathway for kids to be held accountable for what they've done, but to also understand why they've done what they've done, and to receive the guidance and support that they need to redirect their behavior. So a lot of the kids who most commonly become entrapped are kids with disabilities, kids with mental health issues, and Black and brown youth. And in all of those cases, those children need a different kind of support. They need special support based on the needs and, their own individual needs, their family circumstances, and community circumstances. So Oftentimes young people don't make the connection between a decision that they make in the heat of anger or frustration or boredom even, and how it impacts others, outside of themselves. And so just even having that opportunity to understand that is something that can happen through diversion programs. So it's really just an alternate to sending kids into the juvenile justice system. The direct file prosecutions are, it's essentially trying children as adults for certain offenses or holding kids in adult jails. This is where the decision is made directly by the prosecutor without input from juvenile court and juvenile court personnel who actually have the ability to factor in some of those unique characteristics of kids and their unique needs. And, I think this is a place where we really see significant racial bias based on that prosecutor's decision to charge kids as adults. I wanted to point out that I think it was about 10 years ago or so, that the Supreme Court, recognized, as they had done in earlier cases, that children who commit crimes, regardless of the type of crime that it is, are fundamentally different from adults. They obviously don't have the maturity level. Like I said before, they aren't necessarily making a connection to a decision that they're making, without thought and the implications of those decisions. They're much more vulnerable and susceptible to negative pressures and influences, unlike adults, and therefore are less culpable and more likely to change if they're treated as children rather than adults. So, putting kids into the adult system, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but putting kids into the adult system while they are children is just extremely ineffective and very harmful for that child, that family, and the community.
Yeah, and could you talk a little bit about the implications of fines and fees and the impacts those have?
Yeah, fines and fees. That was the third piece. Thank you. So fines and fees are typically assessed for, low-level summary offenses. And that could be, truancy, stealing, things that we talked about earlier, underage drinking, drug possession. And this is where, instead of serving time, and sometimes even when a young person is sent to juvenile detention center, they still may have restitution to pay depending on what the offense was. But this is where a fine or a fee is assessed to try and discourage the behavior. But we all know that both in the juvenile system and the adult criminal justice system, it's an ineffective practice. It criminalizes poverty and low-income families. And it really, in the case of kids, it holds the family or that parent responsible for what a child is doing. And it doesn't really take consideration for, that family's unique challenges and circumstances. So maybe that parent is having difficulty with the child, with disciplining and managing and guiding and maintaining a sense of control and order in the home. And so just to assess fines and fees that parent has to pay, and in most cases, the parent is unlikely to pay, unable to pay, it just really doesn't achieve the intended purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So the current use of direct file and residential placement removes children from their homes and their communities. Could you speak a little bit to the impact that this not only has on children, but on families and communities as a whole?
Yeah. So when direct file happens, I think I mentioned this already, but it really takes the influence of juvenile court out of the picture. So once that happens, there's no really like turning back. And so that kid, so placing, I mean, you just have to think about this. Just imagine a teenager who made a stupid decision. And sometimes I think what happens often is that a young person can go down a pathway to, to, fight another kid or address a situation with confront another kid, right? And then it escalates. Or I think there was a situation where, a student lit something on fire in a school bathroom and it just got out of control and it went immediately to the adult criminal justice system. And it's like just these kinds of foolish decisions that young people make. And when it's dealt with in the adult system, it doesn't really give them the opportunity to learn and to grow and to change as a result of that experience. All of a sudden, they're thrust into this adult environment with people who, there could be a whole range of crimes that were committed with adults. Young people in adult facilities are 9 times more likely to commit suicide. They're more likely to be sexually assaulted, and they're more likely to be rearrested later. And so they sort of now become involved in the adult system as adults when it could have been prevented while they were juveniles. And so I think there's just so many ramifications, what a young person has to do to even survive in an adult facility, the desensitization that has to happen mentally, emotionally in order for them to survive. I mean, just think even about their physique, they're not developed like adults. And, so it really just escalates and leads to so many different problems later in life. One of the other, I think that in the aftermath, the kids now have an adult criminal record, which opens a whole new, can of worms for them long term. So if having a record as a juvenile, oftentimes that record is sealed. And then when they become an adult, they have the opportunity to have it expunged within a shorter period of time. Whereas in an adult system, that's not the case. It's longer term and it's much more difficult to get their records expunged. This is going to obviously impact their ability to, to get back in school, to, get a job with earn gainful employment. And, I think Harvard University put out a report maybe some years ago that showed that when expungement happened, people were able to increase their income by maybe 20% or so. So that's significant, so you're talking about long-term consequences. That means that young person now is going to be even more tempted to, to engage in behavior that's going to bring them the finances that they need, or they become more reliant on their families. And there we go again, we're burdening the families to help deal with some of the aftermaths of, children being involved in adult systems. It's just bad all the way around. It has never proven to make communities safer. It's never proven to, rehabilitate young people. I think that the data definitely shows that young people who are cared for and treated, while they're being held accountable in the juvenile justice system, fare much better in life in comparison to those who are in the adult system. And we're not suggesting, I don't think the recommendations are let these kids get off scot-free, don't hold them accountable, that they shouldn't serve time, or that they shouldn't, have consequences for the behaviors. but it just says that they need to be treated in a different way because of those fundamental differences between children and adults.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. That was such a holistic answer and really encapsulated so many of these different issues that something like direct file touches. For our next question is for Senator Westerfield. So, Senator, you chaired a similar task force to this one that was just chaired in Pennsylvania, but this process in Kentucky several years ago. Could you please speak to your experience with that and kind of the changes you've seen in legislation that was enacted in your state?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Really appreciated, Anna, your remarks there and agreed with all of that. Our work in Kentucky was back during the 2013 session and our 2013 interim time. And we had a really vigorous task force meeting pretty consistently and frequently, more often than a normal group would meet, a couple times a month. And we put together this bill that we passed in 2014 that was, as you described, as I mentioned, it's the biggest changes we've seen in decades. And it was really built around a quote that I refer to often. It guides my juvenile justice work even to this day. And it's from Frederick Douglass. It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. I think that's pretty consistent with Proverbs 22:6, which tells us that, teach or teach a child the way they should go, and when they're old, they won't depart from it. Teach, train up, whatever version of the Bible you're reading. We have an opportunity to make a difference in the early lives of our people when they're still learning and when they're still screwing up. And what we found in Kentucky is that we were waiting until the kids were much deeper into the criminal justice process before we invested any resources in them. We were spending inordinate sums of money, which isn't being a good steward of our resources, to incarcerate them even for status offense cases. In fact, the most jarring statistic I can share with you from Kentucky's experience in this space is this one. We held at the time, back in prior to 2014, we held our juveniles who committed probation violations and misdemeanors within less than 30 days of the same amount of time as the kids who committed felonies. We don't treat grown-ups that way. In fact, there are people who are charged. I was a prosecutor before I came to the legislature. I've seen full-grown adults who don't serve any time for the kind of conduct that we see juveniles serve time for, even months and months and months. And I could give you a fiscal responsibility argument and talk about how stupid that use of money is. In Kentucky, it cost us, back then, it's more expensive now, but back then it cost us just over $100,000 per bed per year to house a juvenile. I think in Hawaii back then, because we looked at every other state, Hawaii was like 130,000, or maybe it was 200,000, just a ridiculous number. I'm sure it's expensive in Pennsylvania. But that's beside the point. It's harmful to these kids to put them through that. And we have data from Kentucky now, and certainly we have data from everywhere else, that as soon as that child's involved in the criminal justice system, they're more likely to come back to the criminal justice system. We were pulling children out of and away from any positive influence we have. When you talk about training up a child in the way they should go, that's going to happen one way or the other, right? The kid's going to learn, just as kids learn wherever they are. They can learn from a teacher, a parent, a school administrator, even a school resource officer, or from mentors that are good. Or you can put status offense kids and low-level offending kids in with the worst offending kids, and that's who they'll learn from, to the tune of six-figure digits per bed per year, all at the same time. It's a terrible way to respond to juveniles and their misconduct. We were doing all of the wrong things, and it was costing us. We weren't even, and adding insult to injury in Kentucky, we weren't even tracking their recidivism. So we thought we were doing what was right, and it felt right with no data to back up whether or not it even worked. And of course, we could see from other states and from other places it doesn't work. I remember having a meeting excuse me, Maddie, I remember having a meeting back when we were still working on the bill and it hadn't passed yet. And it was with school administrators. And by the way, there's a group like this everywhere. And I don't know what it is in Pennsylvania. In Tennessee, it was judges. In other places, it might be prosecutors. In Kentucky, for us, it was school administrators in particular, who, of course, would come to the committee room on the record with cameras rolling, say one thing, but in my office would freely admit, we want the hammer. We want to be able to get them out of the room and lock them up and get them out of our hair. They're worried about their average daily attendance, which in Kentucky is how their funding is apportioned. They have to keep track of how many kids are in the seats, and if you've got a truancy situation or a habitual truancy, which is the vast majority of our status offenders in Kentucky, your ADA figures go down and your budget allocations go down. Has nothing to do with the well-being of the child, has nothing to do with even the well-being of that family or the community, or any regard for the long term, the longitudinal harm you're doing to your own people and your own community by not investing those services early as possible in the life of that child and in that family. I'm glad to say that we were very successful in passing that bill, and it's made a huge change. And we are tracking juvenile recidivism. We created a diversion system that diverts cases even before they have a case number. They never see a judge if they go into the diversion system, and it's been successful to the tune of 95%. And that's from an outside analysis looking at Kentucky's own numbers. And it's still not a perfect bill, but it's been wildly successful. And there's been no rash of juvenile crime anywhere, not even in Louisville, our biggest city, where even crime there by juveniles is declining. There's a way to do this that I think should be informed by your desire to teach kids how to be the best grown-ups possible. And it doesn't involve locking them up. It doesn't involve being as harsh as you possibly can. There are people who deserve that sort of response. There are people for whom the system should respond severely and harshly and swiftly. Kids aren't it. It is ineffective, damaging in the long term, and I believe completely adverse to what the gospel teaches us to do for our children. And you're demonstrating to them an example of how they should treat others when they become the leaders of the community decades later. They're missing the opportunity to show grace, to give people an opportunity, particularly young people who we all know are going to screw up because we all screwed up. You're missing an opportunity to teach them what it means to grow and to give grace when people are learning. You can change the whole system. I believe I won't be in the legislature forever. I wasn't in cycle this year, so I didn't have a stressful Tuesday, but there'll be a day when I'm not there. I think this might be the most profound and most impactful thing I ever had my hand on, because it has a chance to make a big difference in the lives of a lot of people that I'm never going to meet or hear stories about, but that can last for generations. I think everybody should do the same thing in their own states. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Senator Westfield. I think that's a very powerful quote to think about, that children will learn wherever they are. And that is, if anything, an indictment on direct file and the danger of,
no question,
of residential placement for children. So I really appreciate your words there. And the work that you've done in Kentucky. I know most of us here, in Pennsylvania, but we all care about all of these kids. So we're very thankful to see the work that you've done and appreciate it. So moving on to Stephanie, I wanted you to be able to speak a little bit about why is it so important for Christians to care about youth justice reform? And what are some of the next steps that leaders of faith-based organizations and citizen advocates can take to protect children?
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Anna and Senator Westerfield. This has been marvelous. So whenever CPJ is helping Christians consider a public policy issue, we try to encourage the leaders of faith-based organizations and citizen advocates to kind of take a step back while we're discerning a good path forward. And we use 3 words to sort of help remind us of the kind of lenses we want to look through when we're doing this work of discernment together. So I'm going to unpack those for a minute. So the three words we use are image, structure, and wisdom. And for image, we first ask folks to consider what is true about what God says about God's image bearers in the world. For example, every human being is created to bear God's image. And that has implications for how we view every child who is potentially or currently justice system involved. These children are so much more than whatever has led to their involvement with the system. So that's just one frame we try to name what is true about what it means to bear God's image. For structure, as Christians, we try to think about the world that God has made. What are the structures that are in the world, and what are the God-given purposes for these structures? So I'll talk through a couple of examples and how they apply when we look at this type of set of issues. So as Christians, we know that God created the institution of the family, and that families have inherent dignity and worth by virtue of being families. As Christians, for example, we don't look at families as the net sum of their economic contribution to society as their like identity, right? And we look at God's good intent for the families is that they would be the provider of nurture and care for every member of their family. So as Christians, as a matter of our faith, we care about the preservation of families, families being supported in their God-given role, and we care about children being raised in families rather than, for example, spending 23 hours a day in solitary confinement in a facility away from their family. The idea that that kind of thing is happening should motivate us as Christians to act for these types of legislative reforms, which is an opportunity to really focus on keeping families together and justice that aims to provide restoration that supports families rather than policies that actually work against the God-given purpose for families. So that's one, example of structure. Another would be to think about, we know as Christians that God created the institution of government, and it matters deeply to God how government systems, including the juvenile justice system, are structured and administered. And government administered justice systems are the only organized institutional means of upholding and enforcing justice for all. Like what that means is we don't do vigilante justice. And we think that's a really good thing. But it means that as Christians, we see in scripture that justice is always to have a dimension beyond retribution. And particularly when it comes to kids, this is the restorative dimension, and it's super important. And we see all over scripture that the administration of justice must itself be just. In other words, justice systems require just laws and policies that are administered justly. And what we heard earlier today is that much of what is happening in Pennsylvania in the juvenile justice system is far, far away from meeting that standard. And I could go on, but hopefully those examples help make the point about the structures and how we would start to think about what the structures are and what might need to change. And then the third, our word is wisdom. This is where the work of where as Christians, we do the work of discerning together about the needed resources and reforms in light of what we've already discerned to be true about image and structure. Right, we all know that the Bible doesn't say specifically what exactly must be done, for example, when talking about a very specific reform of the juvenile justice system. You are not going to find direct file in the Bible, but you will find plenty of scripture that lays out a case that says how we should care for society's young people and help them to flourish. And that means they should not, for example, be held in solitary confinement 23 hours a day in a federal facility. So if we consider the three types of reforms that help in situations like what we've been talking about today, we find that these solutions are aimed at those that will yield a rightly ordered justice that will give kids, families, and communities the best chance at a flourishing future. So just a little snapshot into how we sort of encourage Christians to think about this. In terms of your second part of your question, what are the next steps for leaders of faith-based organizations and citizen advocates? There's actually really good news, right? The bad news, obviously, is that Pennsylvania's juvenile system is not producing good outcomes for kids, families, or communities today. The good news is we know what to do about it. And that's huge and worth celebrating. We know that there is an intent to introduce legislation in Pennsylvania to address the issues that we discussed today and a few others as well that we didn't have time to discuss today. Things like improving the educational opportunities for kids who've actually already been taken from their homes. And we expect this legislation to be introduced by early January. And we hope to have another online convening in January with some of the legislators who are championing this work in Pennsylvania. We get to learn from Kentucky's awesome example, and we get to work alongside legislators in Pennsylvania who are going to be the standard bearers and champions for this work here. We'll also have an event somewhere around January 24th, and we'll follow up with a date once it's actually confirmed, in Harrisburg. To be at the Capitol in the Rotunda, to talk, stand there with legislators, the press, and representatives of groups that are supporting the effort. And we'd actually really love to see Pennsylvanians be in Harrisburg that day to let legislators know that this issue is important to leaders of faith-based organizations and to citizen advocates who are motivated by your faith. So if you can't make it on the 24th in person, there are definitely other ways you can stay involved in the work. And we will follow up with more information about what those opportunities are. And in the meantime, we just ask if you would please share what you learned about today with your friends and those who you serve in your work. We really want to get the word out among faith-based organizations and citizen advocates who are motivated by their faith about this really important opportunity in Pennsylvania that we do believe is going to change the lives of so many youth, families, and communities.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And I just want to thank all of you, our panelists already. So much of what's been discussed is so helpful. Now we're going to turn into some questions from our participants. So if you haven't had the chance yet, please add any questions you have to the Q&A section. But I'm going to go. Our first question is directed for Anna. And it says, to Anna, what is your perspective on the closing of the Schumann Detention Center here in, I'm going to say this wrong, Allegheny County?
Allegheny, yes.
Allegheny, there you go.
Well, it's a disaster. Primarily because there was no plan in place prior to the closing to deal with children who were using the center or who were being placed at the center. So that's, so now a lot of those kids are being held at the Allegheny County Adult Jail, which is exposing them to all the things we talked about today. So I do know that a number of foundations and local organizations are working on a strategy to, to deal with that absence of that facility. But I think this is also our opportunity to really reimagine and rethink what, more diversion and how youth who would typically be placed in that facility need to be treated. We definitely need the facility because we know that there are youth who commit some serious violent crimes. We're dealing with that now in our community. And so it needs to exist. But I think right now our community, we're just further exacerbating the harm to young people and their families in our communities by not having, a facility in place.
Yeah. Thank you. Our next question is for Senator Westerfield. So regarding your comment the earlier the better for the development of youth.
Yes,
What
I see that. I
complement?
see that
Oh,
question.
great. Yeah, what complementary policies are in place that support young families who may be high risk for the most vulnerable and impactful periods of life, ages 1 through 5?
Not enough is the answer to that question. We have different programs, but they're all, I'm say they're sort of all attached to schools. That seems to be an easy fit because that's capturing most of the students or most of the kids. It does not capture them all, and it's not an equal distribution of those resources. It won't surprise you to learn Pennsylvania, being a fellow Commonwealth, that's got a lot of rural territory and then some big urban centers, that the resources and the programming available in the urban places that have a lot more resources, generally speaking, don't have quite the outreach into the rural areas of the state, like in my neck of the woods. And I'm not one of the smallest rural areas, but we don't have enough, and that's a place where it's actually one of the most important parts of the bill that we passed. And I would beg of you to do this in Pennsylvania. Make sure your bill or any legislation gathers the right data, compels the agencies involved to gather all the information, identify where they aren't gathering it now, but you need to be informed about your policy decisions going forward. But the other thing that's really important is we created this oversight council. So in addition to following the implementation of the bill, the council is tasked with looking at other places where we didn't touch policy, where our big, huge bill didn't fool with anything or address. That's an area that we need to spend a lot of work on. One of the other things, and Anna just mentioned this over in the chat, my biggest regret, I have this same regret now, and I'll leave office one day with this regret, though I've tried to make amends. Our bill doesn't address race or disparate impact at all. In fact, it's been wildly successful, but it brings to sharp relief the disparate impacts we see. The youth that are Black and brown get further into the system than their white counterparts. They get less opportunities at diversion than their white counterparts, if they're offered diversion at all. There's a whole raft of issues that we're not addressing there that I wish we were. And someone asked, and I'll answer this one too, Maddie, the next question was whether or not we've seen community-based programs be more successful at rehabilitating youth. 1000% yes. I mentioned the 95% success rate. What we did in Kentucky was created a multidisciplinary team. I don't know if Pennsylvania has drug courts. I think you do. Kentucky does. As a prosecutor, I used to be one of the members of the drug court staff, and you'd meet as a group. You wouldn't meet with the participant, but the group of the mental health provider, the substance use provider, the social worker, the defense attorney, the prosecutor, and someone from the court system would all meet and just confer on whoever's on the docket. Well, did John go to his meeting this week? Is he paying his child support? Did he go to work? Did he test negative? Whatever. It's a really successful model. We wanted to have that similar model on this juvenile level, so we created something called the FAIR team, a Family Accountability Intervention and Response team. It's a multidisciplinary team. You don't meet with the kid. Each one of those agencies or people represented works with the kid, but they meet and they discuss opportunities and options for community-based interventions. My favorite example, there was a kid who was habitually truant, and he otherwise would have ended up being detained. He would have eventually been charged and locked up. And again, I remind you, within less than 30 days of the same amount of time we hold felons, he would be in custody for a time. But he would, after school or whenever he'd skip school, he'd go to a mechanic shop in this middle of nowhere town in southeast Kentucky that's just dirt poor and nothing happening there, and not a lot of options for programming. But these two brothers own the mechanic shop, and they said they went to the FAIR team folks went to the mechanics and said, look, if you guys will help, it'd be really helpful to get this kid back in school. And they offered. They said, okay, we're going to teach you how to do this. We'll let you come and work here on the condition that you go to school and stay there all day. It worked. And that kid stopped being truant. And he's learning a trade that will undoubtedly serve him well when he's older. Those sorts of interventions never would have come up if we hadn't put all those people in the room to talk about that kid and situation specifically geared for each individual kid. And there are lots of other examples like that where community response has been far more effective and cheaper, if that matters to some of you, and I'm sure it does, and far more effective at actually, again, showing that kid a better response than just locking them up.
That's great. Thank you, Senator Westerfield. So this is to any of our panelists, but in New York City, there are many programs that focus on youth who already have involvement in the legal system. In my opinion, there are not many effective programs that assist our youth in a preventative manner. Are there any programs in Pennsylvania that exist that target prevention rather than assisting youth after they've already got involved with the legal system? I feel like Anna may be our best person to answer this, but
There's all kinds of programs that that help young people, mentoring and family strengthening programs and school-based mentoring and community centers. There's all kinds of programming. But I think the issue, I think in order to have a more effective impact, we need to understand all of the factors that contribute to young people engaging in disorderly conduct or whatever other, offenses. And then we need to supplement the community work that happens with policies, legislation, with investment in communities where these kids live, because the biggest factor is poverty, race, and mental health issues, learning disabilities. This is where it's happening first in schools. And so, if you look at how these kids live day to day and what they have to contend with day to day in their world and what leads them to becoming involved in the system, then you'll see that the community program, as effective and meaningful as it is, will never stop. We'll never stop. We'll always try to do more, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. There are many other pieces of the puzzle that need to work in tandem to make demonstrable change in the community. And that is what's missing when you look at disparities at every level, in education, housing, communities. Listen, as soon as reinvestment or community revitalization happens, the very people in the community who need it most are forced out of the community because they can no longer afford to live there. So how does that make sense? You're just shifting the problem from one zip code to another. So I cannot emphasize enough that it is a comprehensive, multi-dimensional approach that we need to take to move the needle on these issues, to support young people, to make sure they can thrive and be contributing members of society, to live out their fullest potential. It's kind of ridiculous how we treat kids.
yeah, absolutely. Senator Westerfield, you mentioned a previous lack of data to back up the work being done in the juvenile system. How can we hold authority accountable in obtaining and providing more data-driven programs?
You've got to get the data first. So it's frustrating. You can't just jump to the solution you want. But that's how we got into this mess. The knee-jerk reaction to policy, that mentality from the school administrator I mentioned. See, he told this story he said, we had this, and he did actually say this in committee. He did say this, but that there was this anecdote that he shared that this young student did something bad on a Friday. We locked her up over the weekend and she didn't stick a toe out of line on Monday. They respond and think that that's the case with all youth. I was threatened with a switch by my dad. That did the trick. But there are a lot of kids, most kids, who live with far graver threats than that every day, And that's not the way that you encourage them and show them and help them to grow to be healthy and productive and, participating adults in life. And you got to have the data that shows that. And if you don't already have it, if you can't identify the outcomes of your system, if you can't identify how much you're spending, how much time they're staying in custody versus out, how many interventions they've had, how many opportunities they've had or not, if you can't identify the systems you even have now, whether or not the systems and approaches you're trying today work, then you need to force those agencies to share that information. They probably don't know. Our child services agency in Kentucky in 2013, as we were working on the bill, we asked them, how many kids are in your charge? They're responsible for a great many wards of the state. And they couldn't tell us until they put a hand to file folder in each of their regional offices. It took them a few weeks. How in the world can an agency responsible for the lives of human children not know off the top of their head exactly what their census count is that day, where all the kids are, how many are in this program, how many are in that program? It's unconscionable, and certainly isn't the representative of a government that's actually trying to do the right thing by its children. You got to identify those problems and where they are, and you can't do that until you get the data. And if they don't want to volunteer it, and I was blessed with agencies that were pretty willing to cooperate in giving that information even before we mandated it, but not universally, and get a bill through that forces them to do it. Hold their budget accountable. Tell your legislators, if you can't show us your information, I mean, it's public tax dollars, show us where you're spending it. I mean, if they can't answer those fundamental questions, then they're not responsible with the dollars they've got. And I'd say find another home for those dollars. Make the data contingent on funding. Use performance-based funding. There are lots of different tools there, but you've got to get it to identify where your problems are and where your policy options are down the road, and to show what's working and what's not working.
Thank you. This is a good question for Anna. Where can we find resources to support elementary and middle school students whose parents are in jail or waiting in trial or in prison?
Well, in Allegheny County, that's the work that we do here at Amachi Pittsburgh. So you can find us at well, I can put the website in the chat box, or somebody from my staff is on the call can do that. In other counties across the state, there are some Big Brothers, Big Sisters programs that provide mentoring. There are some other community groups. I think you could sort of do a Google search, or maybe even reach out to some of the community-based foundations in your community, because they would likely be funding those programs. You can check with schools and see if there's any in-school supports. United Way is a good place to check, because they're often, supporting a lot of, community organizations as well. But in Allegheny County, we're your go-to, Amachi Pittsburgh.
Anna, thank you. That's so great. I want to jump in super quick, because I was thinking about the sort of structure piece of what I was talking about. And I want to just observe something for the group of people on the call. We moved pretty quickly in between a couple different structures. So in some cases, I just want to observe that these types of things need all hands on deck solutions. So we need faith-based organizations that are going to provide solutions, right? Mentoring programs are not things that we should be, say, for example, paying government officials to spend a whole bunch of time, developing mentoring programs for children, right? When there's fantastic faith-based nonprofits and other nonprofits that are doing great work, right? And that's a whole other structure I didn't get a chance to talk about. It is really important that just as we're thinking about those solutions, we're also thinking about the solutions that are kind of come through reform from the policy level. And in part, that is to try specifically to deal with some of the disparities. So we've had some discussion about that here, and we could probably talk about it for 3 days. But I just think the importance of making sure that both on the data gathering side and then also on the accountability side for those structures, having ways to be able to illuminate the disparity that exists, that may continue in the system as it's reforming, but need to be addressed at the legislative or policy level is going to be hugely important. And our voices contributing to that, not just kind of the hands, feet service work that we know and do expertly in the non-governmental sector. That's sort of what we're inviting you to imagine today, kind of the both and all hands on deck that are needed to try to address these challenges.
Yeah. And if I could add to that, I think that's a wonderful point, Stephanie. And I think, you know, one of the things that we could really push for, it will get resistance, believe me, 100%. But we have so much data. We can drill data down to individuals and how individuals are making decisions in schools, law enforcement, courts. And when we see that an individual is making race-based decisions, or at least the data demonstrates differences in their decisions according to the race of the young person involved in the adult system, why don't we address that and do anything about that? It should be illegal, right? Isn't discrimination unlawful in the United States? We have to be advocating for consequences for race-based decision-making, accountability for it. It should not happen. If you can make a decision to support a child and to divert a child from the system and from ruining his life further, for one kid, why couldn't you do it for the other? So it's already happening. What we need to happen, it already happens. It's just happening for certain kids and not for others. It's not that complicated. But if we held people accountable for the decisions they make, all the adults in the system, the same way we hold kids accountable for sneezing the wrong way on the wrong day of the week at the wrong time, I think we could quickly reverse a lot of the issues we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been such a great discussion, and I feel like there's still so much more to say, which is why we're going to have more of these events coming up. So everyone, I hope you're able to tune back in just a month or two. There will be a recording available afterwards that will be sent out. There will also be several resources that we will be emailing you. We will include the Pennsylvania Task Force findings and recommendations executive summary that will go through all of the issues that we're seeing in Pennsylvania and what the proposed solutions are for those. We'll also be sending out a definition sheet that will have kind of these juvenile justice terms that we've gotten used to throwing around, but for some citizen advocates, they might not be as accessible. And then, of course, we will also be sending out an email that will keep you updated on any upcoming events for future convenings and that in-person event that Stephanie discussed. I just want to thank you, all of our presenters and panelists, so much. Your thoughtful comments and time today are so greatly appreciated. And thank you for all of our attendants, for your great questions and attending, and thank you for your passion for this work. So if you wouldn't mind me, and please join me in closing in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for our brothers and sisters' commitment to loving your children well through their faithful work. Thank you for using them to bless us today. But Lord, I pray that you would give us the wisdom as we proceed in the next couple of months with knowing the best ways to advocate for legislative and systemic change, Lord. I pray that we will be beacons in our communities of change, that we will be known as good neighbors. Lord, please convict the hearts of our legislators, our policymakers, our representatives, our important leaders in our schools, and these people and these children's lives. Lord, we ask that you protect these precious children in Pennsylvania and everywhere else that children are abused by broken systems. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all so much for your attention and participation.